Marhaba, shalom and welcome to the exciting podcast Israel and Palestine Unpacked that is dedicated to exploring the complexities of the ongoing political situation between Palestinians and Israelis. Throughout this podcast, we will explore unresolved issues, the human cost and the diverse experiences and perspectives of those directly affected. These discussions demand sensitivity as the emotional weight of the topic cannot be overlooked. So far, we have focused primarily on the personal stories of individuals, their experiences, struggles and views, which provide valuable insights into how lived experiences shape perceptions. Moving forward, in the near future, I aim to engage with academics, historians, journalists and writers who have examined different dimensions of this complex political landscape. Additionally, we will highlight the significant contributions of peace organizations, both locally and globally, whose work fosters understanding and offers paths towards reconciliation. This podcast approaches the subject from an academic perspective, striving to unpack and better understand the issues at hand. I am not a journalist by trade, and my interviewing skills are continually developing. With each conversation, I aim to grow through self-awareness and constructive feedback. While I may occasionally miss opportunities to further explore claims or subjects, I view these moments as steps in a learning journey that I hope will make each episode more insightful. Finally, it is important to emphasize that all views expressed are those of the interviewees alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of this podcast. On today's episode of Israel and Palestine Unpacked, we speak with Nicholas Blincoe, a writer whose work has reflected his childhood home in Manchester and Bethlehem, the city that became his second home throughout his marriage to the curator and filmmaker Leila Sansour. His history, Bethlehem, Biography of a Town, uses the landscape and historical record to tell the inside story of his city misrepresented by biblical viewpoints. He has also written a history of football in Israel and Palestine, which doubles as a history of grassroots politics throughout the 20th century, as each political group created its own sports club. In September, he publishes a more personal work, Oliver Twist and Me, an intertwined history of Charles Dickens and his ancestor, Robert Blincoe, a memoirist who became the inspiration for Oliver Twist. Nicholas now lives in Shoreditch with his partner, the documentary maker Janet Lee. We hope this episode is both informative and enriching, and if you enjoy conversations like this, subscribe to stay updated as we continue exploring different narratives within this complex and deeply human conflict. In today's episode, we explore the role of football in Israel and Palestine. Our guest discusses what drew them to this subject and shares surprising insights from their research. We dive into the origins of football during the British Mandate period, examining how it paralleled the development of political structures. We discuss the influence of early Jewish Zionist and Palestinian expressions of nationalism through football and the experiences of rival football associations, both nationally and internationally. The conversation also covers how football mirrored broader national and political divides, and whether any teams have ongoing political allegiances. Finally, we examine if football has played a role in bridging divides between Israelis and Palestinians and explore how it could promote a more positive future. What drew you to the subject of football in Israel and Palestine?
Well, to be absolutely honest, it wasn't originally my idea. I lived in Bethlehem for quite a long while, and when I say lived, I meant that my wife had a home there, so we spent a long time each year there. I followed football. I'm a football fan, and my agent thought that that was a good way to get into just to get into the history, and so I leapt at the chance of doing it. So once I've been given the basic idea, I made it my own and did something that I wanted to do, following on from my Bethlehem book, which is really a history from the year dot to the present day in Bethlehem. But Um, it doesn't really go into the history of the 20th century and what you can do with a football book, because the history of Jewish people make politically deciding that Palestine would be the basis of a new homeland. That the history of that project is basically um, the same timeline as the history of football. Um, and all of the football teams in both that now exist in the countries of Israel and Palestine all emerged out of political parties. So you've got a grassroots history of the 20th century told through, yeah, the world's best and most fascinating sport.
I concur with that as well. Um, so just before we get into actually the nitty-gritty and the details of some of the things that you brought up there, was there anything that surprised you initially about when you decided to undertake this research project to write the book?
To be honest, I found all of it really surprising, but perhaps I shouldn't have done. I mean, for instance, that there's um, the reason that Palestine is in FIFA, and FIFA was the first international organization to recognize Palestine as a country. I mean, most international organizations still don't recognize it as a country, as a state. But FIFA were the first, and they did it because Palestine had already been a member of the FA back in the late 1920s. But when you pull that apart, it turns out it was a Jewish nationalist in in British Mandate Palestine who'd managed to join FIFA in the late 1920s. And he hadn't done it for Palestinians or for Arabs. He'd done it as part of the process of creating of having Jewish-run institutions recognized by global bodies. Um, but in order to do it, it had to kind of construct a fantasy football league. And that really amazed me. You know, he's kind of almost pulling teams off the wall and adding Arab names to his proposal so that it looks more ecumenical than it actually is. And this guy, Joseph Yekateli, who was really a gymnast, he only turned to football because he'd failed to join the Olympics. So then he turned his attention to FIFA. Um, so he brought Palestine into the international footballing bodies as part of the Jewish National Project, and then ironically, 80 years later, this becomes the basis of actually less 70 years later, this becomes the basis of Palestine joining FIFA.
Okay.
So that I think that's a great story, but there's loads of weird things like that, unintended consequences.
In terms of the origins of the emergence of football, you talk
Mm.
about it being parallel to the process of the British Mandate of Palestine, and as a part of the para-state structures that the Zionists were creating in that
Mhm.
particular time period. Where were some of the earliest places within the British Mandate Palestine where football entered through, like urban centres, villages, etc.?
Oh yeah, right. It happened before British Mandate Palestine, and it happened specifically in Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. And I mean, the reason really is international schools, at least uh, on the Palestinian side, is St. George's School, which is an Anglican cathedral school in Jerusalem. They've got a sister school, well, at least they had at the time. I don't know whether it still exists. They had a sister school in Haifa, and then in Jaffa. Um, which- Jaffa was the major port city of Palestine at the time, and it also became the first Jewish first port of call for Jews moving there. And most didn't move further because it's a nice place to live and you can make a living, import, export, whatever. And it was especially a popular place for Russian Jews who'd come from Odessa because there was a regular steamboat running between Odessa and Jaffa at the time. So and it's in that city that Jews started playing it for the first time. So Jews were playing it because they bought it maybe bought it from Russia or they'd seen people playing it. They certainly were playing it as an adjunct to other sporting events that were perhaps more popular, which was gymnastics and boxing and things like that. Um, so that yeah, that's really it for Palestinians. It's international schools, especially British schools. Um, the best public school in Egypt, for instance, had a football team, and wealthy Jerusalemites would go there and come back again. So you got Edward Said's family, who's from Jerusalem, but he was schooled at in Alexandria, bringing football back. And because these are another weird thing, I mean, I'm rambling on, but another strange thing is because these were the elite schools, you find that major politicians had played football and continued to love football. There's not just Edward Said, but that people who were deeply involved in the first political parties when Mandate Palestine were formed, and some felt sympathetic towards the British because of their schooling, and then were quickly disabused when they tried to speak to Winston Churchill about being more even-handed because he just
Okay. Yeah. You see, some from my understanding of history within Palestinian society, or what became Palestinian society, the Greek Orthodox
Mm.
often played a huge role as a window into the Western world, where a lot of Western ideas came, including political nationalism and national identity. Um, what role did early Jewish or Zionist and Palestinian expressions of nationalism, various different political parties play in that development? What were some of the first football teams that started to emerge along those lines?
Well, on the Jewish side, there were three football uh, clubs, and they three to start off with, and they were kind of spread. They had teams wherever Jewish people lived in Palestine at the time, which was around the Jaffa area, in Haifa, and around Jerusalem. So the first sporting organization, Maccabi, which is very famous, still a very famous um, international sporting organization, but it was very closely associated with what became the Liberal Party. So they're, in a sense, the centrists. Um, then there's the Workers' Party, which was associated with the trade unions, and they have football teams across, in Jaffa and Haifa and elsewhere. And then towards the end of the 1920s, the Liberal Party were being seen as too cozy with the British, and that the Jewish nationalist project wasn't moving quickly enough. You got a kind of right-wing breakaway, which is Betar. Um, and Betar has kind of multiple origins. The center of Betar internationally was in Poland. Um, uh, but in Palestine, the center was really Jerusalem, and you got Netanyahu's father involved in it very, very early on. And certainly in the late 1920s, it was explicitly a fascist organization. The leader of Beitar in Jerusalem had earlier been in the Jewish Fascist Party of the land of Israel. So you can imagine this is the far right trying to peel people away from the Maccabees, and you see political political ideas about nationalism run straight through football teams.
Oh,
And
totally.
we still have echoes of this today because there are still these are the three football associations of Israel. On the Palestinian side, I'd slightly take issue that they were influenced by Greek Orthodox. The
Okay.
Orthodox Church, unlike the Catholic Church and to an extent the Anglican Church, the Orthodox Church had always allowed liturgy in the national language. And this is why we can talk about the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. And people very much thought at the time that they were part of the Arab Orthodox Church, which has a long history. It's got its saints and its bishops, which go back to the 6th century. So they very much saw themselves as the Arab Orthodox Church, and the Christians were a minority in Palestine, but they were a large minority, and they included quite a lot of the elites. Just, I mean, partly because it's the Holy Land, and so they could make money out of selling the world Palestinian made products, as simple as crosses and things like that. And they were in charge of tourism, which was already a big thing by the 19th century. And Christian families also had bases all around the world, to all around the Christian world, selling the product. So, you might send your son to America or South America or even the Philippines and get them to flog Palestinian made, Holy Land made products. So, a long way of saying that the Christians had their own kind of political nationalism, and you find quite a few. They joined forces with other nationalists, like Muslim nationalists, and you got the more secular nationalists and the more religious nationalists, which I guess would be based around the Mufti at the time in the 1920s.
Yeah, yeah. There's been an awful lot has happened since that particular period of the mandates. You could name a few things off the top of your head. You've had the Nakba, you've had Israel's Declaration of Independence, you've had the Suez Canal crisis, you've had the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur and so on and so forth. There's
Yeah.
an awful lot of water has passed under that bridge. In the context of football, what have been the experiences of each rival football association, if that's what you want to say, both nationally and internationally?
Well, the State of Israel was formed declared in 1948 and was winning the wars really quite quickly in 1948. They established control. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that until 1967, villages inside what is now Israel were treated very much like Gaza and the West Bank are today. That there was martial law from 48 to 67. People in these villages couldn't move out of the villages without, because they were closed military zones, without the explicit um, permission of military authorities. There were curfews. And what football did, oddly, was help break this down. The organisations, especially the Maccabee and I've just gone and forgotten the name of the trade union backed football association.
Histadrut,
Oh yeah, of course it is.
the
No,
Histadrut, yeah.
Histadrut is the trade union, but they've got Histadrut runs a football, or used to run a football association. You got you've got Maccabee Tel Aviv, and you've got the other Tel Aviv. If you get my
Boel, yeah.
Haifa, oh, it's age. I've just forgotten the name. Um, But because these were rival organisations that were looking for government money, and all money came from the government, there wasn't sponsorship, and there wasn't any other way of getting money into the grassroots organisation other than through the government in the 50s and 60s. So they wanted more members. One way of getting more members was to sign up Arab villages. So you find that every single Arab village in the 50s and 60s had two football teams. And it was really just a ploy to get money and to play football, because football is even more popular amongst Arab Palestinians than it is amongst Jewish Israelis. Just partly for historical reasons, partly because football isn't as popular in Russia as other sports. Basketball's always been big. Ice hockey is surprisingly big. Um, so the football associations signed up these football teams, and with a powerful Jewish sponsor in national associations, it became possible to get permission to travel around. And so that was the initial basis of organized semi-professional football in what's now Israel, as Palestinian teams, yes, started to play in the Israeli leagues. On the in the West Bank and Gaza, again, uh, until 1967, they were administered by two different countries, Egypt and Jordan.
Mhm.
And football was played, but it wasn't particularly big. Jerusalem, it was big in the Jordanian league. I don't think the Gaza teams particularly played in Egypt. Um, but football is really popular in Egypt. In Jordan, you've got teams from the refugee camps, and this is it's even today. It's the big flashpoint in uh, Jordanian football rivalry. Two teams based in Amman, and one is basically a Palestinian refugee team from a camp, and one is the team of the Hashemite kingdom. So
Yeah.
that's been quite a violent flashpoint at various times over the last 40 years.
Yeah, because I've a Jordanian friend of Palestinian descent. I think I can't remember the exact details, but I think his mum's from Haifa and his father's from a family from Jerusalem, and
Right.
both left, whether it was in 48 or 67. I don't remember the date. But yes, he speaks fondly of being the supporter of the former team against the Hashemite
Yeah,
dynasty, which is quite interesting. And I've never had the chance to get out to Amman to visit him, but I would like to think that I could get my teeth sunk into a good rivalry out there, as I
oh, you
enjoy
definitely
a
will.
good rivalry here in Belfast, you know. Um, so like continuing on with the theme of national and political identity, for example, today and leading up to today in the last 20, 30 years, how has football in both Israel and Palestine mirrored broader national and political divide? You mentioned earlier about Benjamin Netanyahu's father being involved in the Beitar
Yeah,
movement.
Betar Jerusalem, which is in many ways, the most famous or notorious team in in Israel, because it's an ultra-nationalist team, and it hasn't been afraid to its motto is forever pure, which means, Jewish only. So the fans have rioted and burnt down the clubhouse when there's been any rumor that an Arab or a Muslim sign, let alone a Palestinian. And most Israeli football teams have had Palestinian Israeli players at some point in their history, but Betar hasn't. Um, and yeah, it was a very small circle of Jewish fascists who set up Betar in the early 1930s. They abandoned the what it was called the Jewish Fascist Party of the Land of Israel. They abandoned that and joined Betar, which was a more international organization. But thanks to there was a nationwide strike in the mid 30s, and this meant that there was very little transport moving around the country. So Jerusalem, in many ways, was cut off. So you got an ultra-nationalist fascist team, which incidentally was simultaneously got a terrorist wing, a secret terrorist wing that was setting up car bombs and things during the national strike, um, operating in Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was the only truly multinational integrated city. So the same team is playing for cups against other Jewish sides, but also against Muslim and Christian sides.
Mhm.
Um, Quite why Betar were so anxious to play their enemies. I think it was I think it was because they believed that this would prove their superiority in the same way that the Ku Klux Klan in America was always anxious to play baseball games against black teams. Um, it, it excited Betar. And we tend to link the history of Betar from the 1930s to the present day, and it's slightly difficult to link things that have lasted for so long. But there is a continual history. It's always been associated with the party that became the Likud party in the 1960s. It's always had politicians appear at the stadium. But today it's very much what you would call what I would call an Arab Jewish team, and perhaps Israelis would call a Mizrahi team, because Jerusalem was became the home um, became the home, especially for Iraqi Jews in the 1970s, and they gravitated towards Betar.
Hmm.
So it's a team with roots in European fascism, but in other ways, it's the team that most represents the 60% of Israelis who aren't of European heritage.
Yeah, Mizrahi and Sephardi backgrounds.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Like there's lots of questions go through my head, but like were you talked um quite well about Beitar being, associated with the right and with the connection with the Likud party. In terms of the left of the Hapoel, your Hapoel Tel Avivs and your
Hapoel
Hapoel.
was the word I was trying to think of earlier.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, yeah, they're the leftist team. I think I
Yeah.
don't remember the name of the stadium, but was it Hapoel Tel Aviv that a famous Irish footballer managed, Robbie Keane?
How did Robbie Keane manage Hapoel Tel Aviv?
I think it was Hapoel Tel Aviv. Now,
Uh,
please don't quote me on that. I've obviously now outed myself, recorded, but I know that he was
well,
out there for a
very famous
season.
Europeans passed through the teams in Tel Aviv. So,
Yeah. So in terms of the political allegiances that even if there are a lot of football teams in the UK and Ireland, for example, North and South, that have allegiances with particular political parties, but even if there isn't an established connection between a political party, they have opinions, political positions. Like Celtic, for example, are very much
yeah.
on the left of the political spectrum, support the Palestinian cause. Rangers are on the right. You've got Barcelona, you've got Espanyol, you've got Hamburg, you've the historical St. Pauli in Germany, for example. Are there teams on the left in Israeli society? And even extend that in terms of a Palestinian sense, whether it be Jerusalem or the West Bank or Gaza, that have political allegiances to parties, even if it's just within the support base.
Uh, on the Israeli side, certainly, because Hapoel is the party of trade unionists, and Maccabee um, is the party of more of the right, and Betar is the party of the ultra right. In Palestine, it's slightly different because they're all nationalists, and Hamas had. I mean, they were famously in Hebron. It turned out that a football team they all became Hamas operatives in like 2002.
Hmm.
Um, but Hamas, right, and it runs technical colleges and things like that. I mean, it's quite recent that we've lumped together Hamas's military wing with Hamas's political wing. In England, it was only 3 years ago that we outlawed the political wing
Okay.
um, under the ultra-conservative government, Priti Patel, who I don't know if your Irish readers are aware of. I'm sure you are, been
Very
involved.
much aware here in
Yeah,
this part of Ireland. Yeah, we
yeah,
the same government, so up
of
until
course.
the last election.
Um, so there are there are certainly college football teams that you'd feel are Hamas, but in the leagues, it's not obvious that anyone has a political allegiance because they come from places. Um, and so it's a kind of underground politics, whether, I mean, insofar as anyone's a card-carrying member of a political party in Palestine, and since Israel has managed to get them all outlawed, that poses problems. I mean, the PFLP, when I was living in Bethlehem, was the middle class political party. It represented liberal, usually Christians.
Okay.
But it's now a terrorist organization, so you wouldn't be walking around saying you're a member of the PFLP. You wouldn't be walking around saying you're Hamas necessarily. You might still say that you're Fatah, but Fatah's quite unpopular. But there's a kind of subterranean politics of whether you come from a refugee camp, which the biggest team in Nablus is the refugee camp team, or whether you're sponsored by business, which it would be true of Hebron teams. Hebron is really the the sense the engine of the Palestinian economy. It's a really hard-working town where traditionally people have got out and got out into into the wider world, like into China, and brought products back to Palestine. It's very much a mercantile city,
Yeah,
Hebron.
yeah. The textiles comes to mind, for example.
Yeah,
I know it's a very
the pottery that
significant part.
I'm sure you've got some Palestinian pottery. It comes from Hebron. If you've got a kafir, it will tend to have come from Hebron.
Hmm.
But even in the context of Palestine, if you buy an ironing board, it will tend to have come from maybe China, and a Hebron trader will have gone over to China to buy it.
Okay. Interesting. That's very interesting. That is. It's been a long time since I've been in Hebron. It's obviously a city that's marked by its tension
Yeah,
with the mosque, with the Israeli controlled area beside that,
it's
and that
quite a
often
large city
overshadows.
though. Uh,
Pardon?
it's because it's quite a large city. It's got this horrible downtown um, tension, but in the wider Hebron, it's a big city, so people find ways to live. Whereas a very small city like Bethlehem, you're always banging your head against the checkpoints and the wall. In Hebron, there's it's a big city by Palestinian standards, so it's got its own internal economy, and
Yeah.
in many ways, powers the Palestinian economy, and it's got the best football teams usually. It tends to be a Hebron football team that challenges.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the West, because we're in a European context and Israeli teams play within a European context,
Mhm.
you're obviously much more aware of your Hapoel Tel Avivs, your Beitar
Mhm.
Yerushalayim, Bnei Sachnin,
Oh yeah,
which is an interesting example. I remember they were in Europe before and they played Newcastle United a long time ago. It's
yes.
probably going back about 15, 20 years ago, but
Beta Sackneen are great. Sons of Sackneen are a great example of. There were two teams in Sackneen. There was a Hapoel team and a Maccabee team. But when Israel decided they would start selling off the football teams in the way and modernize the game in the way it's been modernized in Britain, the mayor of Sackneen just merged the two teams and really created what has been the powerhouse of Palestinian football in Israel. It's won their equivalent of the FA Cup. It's usually in the Premier League. It's a difficult team to beat, and it's always done really quite well.
yeah, that was the next kind of topic I was curious to come on to because like football as a sport, as a way of life, as an imagined community of people with a set of values together, they can often, how can I put it? They can often exacerbate political tensions and they can often act as kind of repositories for good, for
Yeah,
communal and social change. Um, and there's such a big drive within the European context, particularly to try and separate football from politics and vice versa. How
yeah.
you do that, I don't know, because as people, we are political beings, irrespective of what we believe or practice or who we vote for. But like in your research, like you mentioned B'nai Sachin, in your research, did you find examples where football has helped to bridge divides between Israelis and Palestinians?
Um, yes. I mean, only because Israel and Palestine have been at odds um, virtually since the peace process collapsed in 97. I mean, they've always been at odds, but it's got much, much worse since 97. And we're going back almost 30 years now. There's not much between Palestine and Israel, and they play in different um, continents. Israel has been rewarded for the peace process, which it wrecked by becoming part of the European football
Hmm.
world, and Palestine was also rewarded, but became part of the Asian football world. So there's no communication between Israel and Palestine. But what's happening in Israel is that there are extremely good Palestinian footballers who'll play um, football professionally for Israeli teams, usually Jewish-owned teams, because there's only really Bnei Saknin as a Palestinian team. And so this has created a kind of sense within the football, football's its own world. Within the football community, it's created a sense that it's a level playing field, that people take each other on their own merits, uh, good rises to the top. Football players, if you're keen on football and you're a Jewish kid, you tend to have been to Arab villages that none of your friends have ever been to. You've eaten with Palestinian, you met their mums, so there's a much more closely knit footballing community in Israel, which often prides itself on its lack of bigotry and prejudice. And there's a website which I'd advise you all to take a look at, called Baba Goal. Baba is a word for father, and goal is obviously the word for goal, but it's spelled Gol. Baba Goal, which celebrates this. And it's a great website, and the guy who runs it is a nice guy. But there is a kind of blindness there because they feel that it's a level playing field. They'll equate their experience as being equal to a Palestinian experience. And they just don't get the Palestinian experience. They don't get that they're living in an apartheid state. They don't get that there's this ceiling on ambition and everyone's ceiling on everything, really. I mean, even freedom of movement is very difficult, even within Israel. And then when that gets applied to things like Gaza, I remember an interview with the guy who runs Baba Gol on the Guardian podcast, and it really ended up being a kind of, for me, something that a bit of a car crash, because he's always equating the Jewish experience with the Palestinian experience. And this was when whole cities were being wiped out through bombing. There's that kind of blindness that one gets in an apartheid state, no matter how, you can be a man of goodwill and fail to see these blind spots. And I guess that would be the thing with football. Football is a level playing field in so many ways. It's definitely where you can see the best of Israel, but it's still got problems. And I think in any community that's got these huge apartheid-like issues, there's got to be more sense of truth and reconciliation and restorative justice in addition to the sport. I mean, sport can't do it on its own, and you can't wiping politics out of sport is just another way of cementing power in the hands of whichever group is in the ascendancy.
Mm-hmm. See, just going back to something you said earlier about Israel wrecking the process, the peace process. So, for example, at that point, I can almost hear in my head people who have sympathies with the Israeli side would be like, oh, how did they do that? And if they did do that, how did Palestinians play their part in that as well? Because they would often argue there's two to tangle together.
Yeah.
In what sense do you think that Israel has, and even if you include Palestinians as well, have undermined that process?
Um, well, I mean, one of the great disasters of the peace process is that one of its leaders was immediately murdered. Rabin was murdered by the Jewish Israeli right. And so insofar as you've got two narratives, you've got the one that supports Israel. They've really taken on board the narrative of the Jewish Israeli right, that it was wrecked by terrorism, and by Hamas and terrorism. And Hamas did launch terrorist campaigns in the late 90s. Often just battling for position within the Palestinian polity. And so you could say, yeah, Israel's got security problems, policing problems. How does it keep its people safe? What does it want out of a future a future settlement? What is the future? What are the future lines of peace? And this is why I would blame Israel, because if you ask those questions, what is the what is the future settlement? What do they imagine for their state? How do they imagine Palestinians and Israelis will function together? There is no Israeli offer to the Palestinians. I mean, there's none whatsoever, and there never has been. Um, Whereas the offer they're making to the Jewish nationalist movement is unlimited settlement, unlimited colonialism, unlimited power, uh, eternal ascendancy over not just within Israel's borders, but over the whole of what I would call historical Palestine, because that's what it is. Uh, and also an ascendancy over the broader region. And because after Rabin's death, Netanyahu, with some pauses for other people like Ariel Sharon, Netanyahu has been in power virtually since 1997. There's never been an alternative to him. And his politics remain the politics of his father, which is a supremacist, racist, apartheid party.
Okay. So, what role can football play positively within Israeli and Palestinian society to bring about a movement for change, if that's at all possible?
Um, yeah, I think football is one of the few ways that Jewish Israelis learn about the rest of their community. So the more football is played at a more and more junior level, um, the more people travel around their own country, enter villages, enter towns and villages. Because I think this is something that perhaps your listeners won't understand, is that there are no communities at all in Israel where people live side by side. You've got some of the big cities have communities that are largely cheek by jowl, but people live separately. But for the most part, a town is either a Palestinian town or it's a Jewish town. And so football is one of the few ways where people just travel. People go and play a game, and then immediately after the game, get fed an enormous amount of food by someone's mum. It's one of the few ways where people learn how other people live. And in a country where the education systems are separate, the towns are separate, the political parties are separate, apart from the old Communist Party, which is mixed and doesn't win any seats. Um, it's really the only way that people can see for themselves that uh, the rhetoric of the Israeli right is untrue. So I would say that yes, more and more football would definitely be a good thing, but because I feel it's also got to go in hand with something else, something quite politicized like truth and reconciliation. It's probably far-fetched at the moment to imagine Israel taking that on board.
There's an awful lot of truth and reconciliation needs to be done, and I know that people point to the example of South Africa
Mm,
of that period of the truth, the amnesty as such. That's another controversial term.
yeah,
We've had it in Northern Ireland with the paramilitaries, with the amnesty of their prison sentences being
yeah,
cut short as a part of the agreement. Even with that process of truth and reconciliation, whether it happens within Palestinian society, they often also have to go through their own process separately, and Israelis have to go through that process themselves, and they both have to go through it together. There's an awful lot more pain to come.
yeah,
And I think, that's one of the things. And football, I know from the 20th century that much of the social psychological research was very much based on the idea that crowds were always a problem.
yeah,
People lose their individuation. and they got absorbed into the group
Yeah.
ethos. But obviously, that's been shown that there are positive things that can come from the crowd, you know, and it's just interesting to be able to unpick that and the idea of movement about within the country, within a state, to play between Bnei Sachnin in the north and Hapoel Beersheva or whoever else it may be, um, allows people then to be able to move about in different places because they're forced to interact in some kind of way and integrate.
Yeah, I mean, football at that level, people don't tend to integrate much because they're policed. I really meant a more grassroots level where school children are bussed around.
Yeah.
But but yeah, even so, it's a good thing to go and look at your own country and see how the whole country lives. Um, I think Palestinians know Israel much better than Israelis know Israel because Palestinians have always had to move around to earn a living.
Okay.
Um, and there's that Hegelian phrase that the master doesn't know anything about the slave, but the slave knows the truth of the master.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to express my deepest gratitude to our guest Nicholas for his openness and willingness to share his personal views, experiences and rich stories. Looking ahead to our next episode, we'll be speaking with Rav Hanan Schlesinger, an American-born Orthodox rabbi, educator and activist renowned for his commitment to fostering understanding and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. He is a co-founder of Roots, also known as Shorashim or Jadur in Hebrew and Arabic respectively, a grassroots initiative dedicated to promoting non-violence and transformation through dialogue and mutual recognition. Until then, I would like to thank you for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe or follow us if you are interested in this content. And if you have any thoughts, feedback or questions on the episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out via email at israelpalestineunpacked@gmail.com or connect with us through our Facebook page. All contact details are listed in the description below.